a common slogan of science advocates, that is, science communicators and people who understand science and promote it in the world, will say something like, and I think this traces back to someone like Galileo, that maths is the language of the universe.
Yes.
What do you think of that as a slogan?
I mean, so what's interesting about Galileo, and there's a kind of interesting irony there, is Galileo is hearkening back to Plato, because of course Plato did hold mathematics to be important. He was part of the anagogic ascent, right? And I think there's importance to the way math allows us to consider. I'm going to try and use very neutral language because everything is controversial when what we're talking about here. It gives you access to temporal, spatial, causal, structural, functional patterns that are not otherwise directly observable by human beings. On one side, gives you a powerful community. Science is not done by one individual. It makes use of the collective intelligence of distributed cognition, and it's a powerful machine for overcoming powerful mechanisms of self-deception, both within individuals and groups. You put those two together, and I think there's great truth to that idea. Now, of course, we could get into the weeds about are we going to give a Platonic answer to that or a Kantian answer to that? And I don't know if we want to do that. I'm not particularly interested in that right now. But if you are, I'll follow it. But I do think that math gets you to consider ways in which the universe unfolds. Again, I'm really struggling to use neutral language here. That do not necessarily readily map onto sort of Homo erectus understanding of daily events where things are bumping into each other and smashing into each other. And I think that is a significant gain. I think this is where Plato is better than Aristotle. Aristotle ultimately, now Aristotle's a genius, but there's a grounding in sort of common sense intelligibility of everyday experience. And Plato was willing to call that into question. And so I think science taps into that. Now, what I don't see is, and this isn't not because it's not possible, and I want to actually address that point in a second, but I don't see in general the scientific project as having addressed the non-propositional aspects of us that are not typically captured well or immediately by math. Now, I do think we have maths now. I think dynamic systems theory, complexity, and I think the way that is now intermeshing with a more adaptive, biologically based understandings of cognition, 4E cog sci, give us the possibility of saying, well, why do human beings care about this weird meaning? Even the word meaning is a metaphor, right? They're not primarily or exclusively talking about semantic meaning. They're talking again about this kind of connectedness, this fittedness. They solve problems well, etc. They're talking about their agency, their adaptive agency. And I think we're now at a place where we can talk seriously about it. In fact, that's one of my proposals. My proposal is, with the advent of 4E cog sci conjoined with dynamical systems theory, complexity theory, we can now start to explain in without having to be caught in the homuncular circle of just explaining it with other mental terms. We can explain the mind, cognition, intelligence, meaning, in a way that makes sense of it and explains and gives a good account of why we seek it, why it's adaptive, and therefore how we could potentially screw it up or improve it. And so I think there's an opportunity for us here now. So if you allow me to broaden science out to the special sciences and not just fundamental physics, I think there's an answer available within science, thus understood. Again, I want to emphasize cognitive science also, right, gives an appropriate and I think an important role to philosophy, because I think your naturalism is not just what you can derive from your fundamental sciences or your special sciences, but also what is fundamentally presupposed by them, like that the world is intelligible, that you're a meaning-making agent, etc.
Yeah, I mean, it seems to me that the methods of science and the language of mathematics simply can't bear on the non-propositional aspects of human experience. They can't bear on things like meaning. They can't bear famously on things like ethics. And I wonder if you think, I mean, there's a common story that's told, particularly I find by religious apologists, that the reason everybody is depressed and nihilistic is because they've adopted what they, and they use this term in a sort of derogatory manner, they say scientism has taken over the minds of the modern human being, in that we think that everything can be explained in terms of science. We think that everything can be mathematized. But because science can't explain ethics, it can't explain meaning, it can't tell you why to get out of bed in the morning, this is why we've found ourselves landing in this meaning crisis. And they will say that the best way of bringing that back is to reinsert religion into popular culture and into society. Whether or not you agree with that, do you agree with the first diagnosis that too scientific a way of thinking can exacerbate this problem as well?
Well, it depends. I mean, you want to make a distinction between properties of your theory and properties of the referent of your theory. My theory of vagueness should itself be very clear. My theory of metaphor shouldn't just be a string of metaphors. So I think we can properly have a theory of these things. That doesn't mean that the causal process of non-propositional knowing is theorizing or propositions, but I think we can come up with very clear and I think ultimately formalizable theories about the non-propositional. I don't think there's any, I don't think there's a propositional or a performative contradiction there. I mean, you could make performative contradictions, but I don't think that it's necessary. So I think you really have to distinguish between what are we claiming here? Are we claiming that a scientific theory of these is not possible, or are we claiming that scientific practice can't generate these things? I think both of those are true, and I don't think they contradict each other at all. I think it's possible to have a scientific theory of them, but I don't think that meaning, that the way we're talking about it here, is generated by theorizing as a particular action or practice. And again, that's not contradictory, and I don't think that binds you. Now, to be fair, I mean, so first of all, that's a pushback against that original framing. I mean, some of what goes under the name of scientism, I do reject, which is, this idea that science, if I can't show how a claim can be derived from science, and often this is in a reductive thing, from fundamental physics, then I can't make a knowledge claim. And of course, that's ridiculous, because that claim itself can't be derived from fundamental physics, and it gets you into a performative contradiction and all kinds of loops. So I think if that's what the target is, I agree with it for philosophical reasons. But like I said, I think I do this. So I hope it's not a contradiction. I say, here's the best cognitive science on this. And then here's what the cognitive science says are good and bad practices. What are the design features? How could we put them together to optimize trade-off relationships between various practices, strengths and weaknesses, so that we could improve this function, right? And I don't find any contradiction. And then given that, I can say, I think this particular religious framework might have been doing this well. This one was doing this well. This was doing this well. And I want to learn from that, right? I want to respectfully learn from that, but I want to understand. I want to say this without sounding dismissive, but I want to learn the functionality of this. You and I have been talking, or at least I've been talking, and you've been gracious to let me talk about the functionality that religion used to perform. And and like I say, I'm not nostalgic, but I think there's something to learn from the religions about that functionality. But I think there's something to learn independent from the religions, from 4E cognitive science, for example, and its connection to related disciplines, the home disciplines, neuroscience, artificial intelligence, biology, etc. And I am trying to get these two to be as conciliant with each other as possible. So, I think it's only historically contingent to blame science for the meaning crisis, in the sense that I would say, yes, science up until recently couldn't do the kind of thing I'm talking about. But one of the fundamental properties of science is its ability to self-correct and re-engineer itself in important ways. And I think we're at that stage now